What the fuck? Oh, hey there, I'm KEiZ. Today we're looking at the Art Primo Bullet paint marker, so let's get into that. This is marketed as having a super permanent paint formula, so we're definitely going to have to put that to the test. On the side of the marker it says shake well. That's going to be important later. Make sure this marker is well shaken. And on the cap there's this perfect little B to indicate it's a bullet marker. The body of the marker is a blue with an Art Primo label wrapped around it. It comes with a 4mm nib that's replaceable, and while it's not made to be flipped around, we're going to give it a shot anyways and see if it can work as a fine point or a fine liner. The nib looks about 4 to 5mm wide and at the very tip close to 1mm. The shape of the nib is what makes it a bullet marker. Now let's measure the outside of the body. It looks about 15 centimeters by 1.5 centimeters wide, making this a pretty comfortable daily carry. I'd be happy to pop this in a pocket and walk around with it all day. If it being a paint marker isn't enough already, there's a mixer ball inside the marker and a warning on the side that you should shake this up prior to use. After you've given it a good shake, let's get a close-up shot of that nib for all of you nib saturation lovers. Ooh, look at that nice red. The first surface we're going to test is just the plain paper of a black book. Because it's a paint and not an ink, I'm not worried about it bleeding through paper and staining the papers underneath it. But that's why we got to test it, so let's make sure that hypothesis is right. And as you can see, it writes really nice and the lines don't bleed into the paper. And sure enough, unless the marker is super duper juiced, it's not going to bleed through to the paper underneath. Now we're going to draw a few lines, one with the very tip of the nib and one with the side of the nib, to see how much they differ. Using just the tip of the nib, we get a 1mm line, and using the fat side, we get a 3mm line. Our next experiment is flipping around that nib. While they marketed it as replaceable, not reversible, we're going to see if it's reversible too. The idea behind this is that it reduces the nib down, so maybe it'll give us a nice finer line that we can control a little bit easier. And sure enough, this reduces the tip of the nib down to 1mm, which could definitely be useful if you're doing some finer detail work or just doing some close outlines. And while it kind of works, the nib wiggles around inside of the body, so if you're doing some fine details, it might squiggle around and mess up whatever you're working on, which could be very frustrating. Now let's test it on some stickers. This is what I like to use my bullet marker for the most, just because I really like how the paint sits on top of the stickers. Unlike an oil-based marker, they don't take forever to dry and they don't bleed into each other. Here we've got a whole assortment of different slaps and blanks to try this on. On our 2-to-8 paper label, the alcohol paint is quickly absorbed into the surface of the paper, and it writes perfectly smooth with no catches or streaks. On the Art Primo paper stickers, it's the same thing. No line bleeding, and you can get a really nice crisp, clean lines. And not to mention that the reds are almost the same color, so it's really appealing to the eye. It makes the sticker look a lot more professional. Dollar store name label gives you some nice squeaking sounds as you write. And it might take a little bit longer to dry because it doesn't get absorbed into the surface, but it's still going to work absolutely fine. On some glossy paper of the 3800N label, we're seeing no issues except that it starts to pick up the green pigment, so maybe not the best sticker for this marker. On the spray painted mail slap, it writes just fine, it doesn't pick up any of that spray paint. That's a big bonus because a lot of oil-based markers will start to pick up the spray paint. If you've used eggshells before, then you know they have a very specific texture. The vinyl plastic they're made out of can sometimes grab onto your markers and cause them to streak or just catch. If the nib is even slightly dry, it starts to get these streakies and makes it really hard to use and write with. So before you try and swing an eggshell with this marker, make sure it's very juiced and keep it juiced the whole time. Next, we're going to put that mini nib to action and see how it writes on a sticker. And while there is a little bit of wobble, it's controllable, so I think this would totally work. I'd even say this is good enough to call a feature of the marker. On the eggshell, it doesn't create one solid layer, it creates this kind of texture. I also happen to have a black bullet marker, so I'm going to use that for this outline. Next up, we got a glass picture frame. This is to test how it writes on glass. And oh my goodness, the sound it makes is glorious. Just listen. As you can see, it writes super well on glass and was super satisfying the whole time. It creates one really solid opaque layer. It doesn't require extra coats. If you watch the Art Primo review of this marker, Green Ranger spends a good minute drawing some pieces on some glass, and now I understand why. It's super duper satisfying. And not to mention, it looks great. It creates one really solid color. It doesn't have varied undertones or anything like that. Once again, we're using that black marker to create a nice outline. That's one thing that's worth noting with these markers is they need to be shaken constantly. They settle very fast and need to be mixed up pretty much anytime you try and use it. And every couple of lines, you gotta shake it again. We're gonna test how this marker writes on the metal by drawing a little person, or specifically the person. The paint shows no hesitancy to write on the metal, creating one solid opaque layer in just one coat. Next up, we got the plastic of my own beloved trash can. This trash can has a much rougher and a more porous surface, so we're going to see how it handles the paint. And as you can already see, because of how porous the plastic is, when the paint touches the surface, it immediately gets pulled into the surface of the trash can. You get less opaque colors and much more faded look. This means it's going to take a coat or two to get a really solid, bright color. Lastly, we got the painted wood. This is just a piece of wood that's covered in some bucket paint. The alcohol paint in this pen starts to pick up the house paint that's on this board. Next up, we're gonna distress that nib. Distressing the nib is when we break up the fibers at the tip of the nib to give us a more flared out and fat style of line. As you can see, this nib has already gotten a little flat just from writing on a few surfaces with it. But we're just gonna hit it with some sandpaper. Your nibs will naturally distress as you write on rougher surfaces like some nice bricks, some rocks, whatever you're writing on your markers with. And as you can see, this will break up the tip of the nib, and if that's not enough for your taste, you can also go at it with a small X-Acto knife and just slice up the tip, break up those fibers. Always be careful when flaring out your nibs not to do it too much. You want to be able to still put the cap on, because if the cap doesn't fit, then you're boned. As you can see, the nib is perfectly bullet shaped, all nice and smooth. And after distressing the marker, you can see there's no fine bullet tip anymore. The fraying fibers increase the surface area, meaning it lays down way more paint. Once we've distressed the nib, it's drawn a solid 5mm line. When you write with a flared out nib, it feels a lot more like writing with a graffiti mop. The line size is less varied and stays at a consistent width. Now let's buff this paint and see how it does. The first surface we're testing is that glass. We're going to hit it with just a wet paper towel and we're going to start scrubbing. And as you can see, it starts to pick up some of the paint, but this is not because of the water. This is happening because the paint does not properly adhere to the non-porous surface of the glass. And as I scratch with my fingernail, you can see it starts to chip off. Next up, we're going to hit it with some isopropyl alcohol. And that picks this stuff right up. Seeing as it's alcohol based, this does make sense. And as you can see, a few squirts of alcohol and we can lift all of this paint right off. This is something to keep in mind when you're trying to swing this marker. Try and avoid places that are just going to be easily cleaned with some alcohol or any kind of solvent. Next up, we got the metal canvas. Let's see how the person holds up to the persecution The water doesn't do much here. You can see it's spreading around a little bit, but that's just because I'm using the same rag that had the alcohol on it. So I don't really think that's the water. I'm pretty sure that's just my bad for using the alcohol rag. Fingernail test, and it doesn't really scratch off as easy, but we're gonna squirt some alcohol on there and picks it right up. Alcohol is what this paint is based off of, so of course the alcohol is just gonna lift it right up. While alcohol lets the paints dry really fast, it also is the downside of being what most hand sanitizers are made out of. So a quick squirt from hand sanitizer and your tag might be buffed in just a second. Next up, we got the trash can. You splash a little bit of water on there and start scrubbing, and this isn't doing anything in the slightest. Now here's where this paint shines. While the alcohol does dissolve the paint, the porous surface of the trash can immediately pulls that thinned out paint back into the surface. Spritz some water on our painted wood to simulate some rain and give it some scrubbing, and that stuff's not coming off. This just shows me that the rain is not going to do anything to this paint. Next, we're gonna try some alcohol. Nobody would ever use alcohol on a painted surface because if it's painted, they're probably just gonna try and paint over it. Because as you can see, all this does is smear it around. Next up, we're gonna give it a cover test. I've got a cheap indoor paint and primer, and we're gonna give it a few coats and see how it handles. Near the top of the board, I'm giving it really thick layers of paint, and near the bottom, I'm giving it much, much thinner layers of paint. Seeing as this is a paint and most paints don't really bleed through very much, I'm not expecting very much here. And after this really nifty transition, whoever did that transition deserves a pay raise. You can still see some of the red through on the thinner layers, but that's not because of that paint. That's just because red is a darker color than white. So of course a thin layer of white is not gonna properly cover red. Okay, now let's talk about this marker. The pros of this marker are that it's not overpriced, it dries quick, it has a good carry size, and it's weatherproof. The cons are that it's an easy chem buff, it's not super bleedy, and it needs constant mixing and juicing. As far as the best uses for this marker goes, I would say it works great on your slaps and all your stickers. On a really porous surface like our trash can, it does a great job. And on pretty much any high place the poor buff man can't reach. As far as your worst surfaces go, pretty much anything that's been painted, your mom's carpet, or an easily reachable non-porous surface. Overall, this marker is super fun, and I think it's definitely worth the price. I highly recommend you go pick one up yourself. Well, thank you homies for watching. If you're seeing this here, congratulations, you made it to the end. You mean a lot to me. You can watch some of my other videos or subscribe. I love you homies so much, and I'll see you guys in the next one.